Ever wonder what the qualifications are for the different categories of American whiskey, like wheat, malt, and rye? Well, I'm going to tell you on this episode of Whiskey Specs. Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Whiskey Specs, the part of the channel where I give you the details behind different whiskey categories. I'm Ryan, and today I'll be going over all the qualifications it takes for an American whiskey to be labeled as either wheat whiskey, malt whiskey, or rye whiskey. So enough talk, let's get into it. In order for an American whiskey to be labeled as either a wheat whiskey, a malt whiskey, or a rye whiskey, it must be made from a grain mixture that is at least 51% of that grain. Now, there is a difference between malt whiskey and single malt whiskey. And there's also another category called single malt American whiskey, and I will be covering those topics in future episodes. You may have heard the term wheated bourbon thrown around a lot lately, but a wheated bourbon is not a wheat whiskey. In order for something to be labeled as a bourbon, it still must contain at least 51% corn in the mash bill. So a wheated bourbon has a secondary grain of wheat instead of the typical rye. There's also a newer category of American whiskey called single malt American whiskey. And again, that is not necessarily a malt whiskey. In order for an American whiskey to be labeled as either a wheat whiskey, malt whiskey, or rye whiskey, it must be made from a grain mixture that is at least 51% of that grain. It must be aged in a new charred oak barrel, distilled to no more than 160 proof or 80% ABV. It must have a barrel entry proof no higher than 125 or 62.5% ABV. And it must be bottled no less than 80 proof or 40% ABV. A corn whiskey does not fall into this category because it has different rules and regulations, and I will be covering that in a future episode. If a whiskey meets all of these qualifications, it can be labeled as either wheat, malt, or rye whiskey. Well, that does it for today's episode of Whiskey Specs. If you enjoyed the episode and you learned something new, don't forget to like and subscribe. Also leave me a comment and let me know what your favorite American whiskey is. Do you like the ryes? Do you like the wheats? Or does the American malt whiskey pique your interest? I love to hear what you guys have to say. And remember, guys, no matter how busy you are, there's always time for a drink with friends. Stay safe, everyone.